Welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine. This is our first real episode, and I'm really excited to share it with all of you. Most of you probably know me from my most recent book, More Everything Forever. This show isn't going to be that book. It's more of a follow-up. Some of you may have heard me on other podcasts saying that the true title of More Everything Forever in my heart is actually These Fucking People. And I couldn't do a show about these fucking people because I would hate that. And I don't want to have a weekly podcast about something that I hate. Instead, I really want this show to pick up where More Everything Forever left off, which is asking questions about what a realistic good future could look like. And that's why I brought on this week's guest, Reo Eveleth. Reo was actually one of the first people I talked with about More Everything Forever back when I was first considering writing it. And they helped me think through some of the big ideas in the book. But they also gave me a really important piece of the end of the book. Reo pointed out to me that the people I was writing about, their ideas about the future aren't just impossible, but also really narrow. Because in reality, the future is open. Of course, the tech oligarchs don't want us to see the future as open because controlling our idea of the future controls what futures are allowed to happen. Breaking out of that dynamic is what this show is about, and it's a lot of what Reo and I talked about this week. I hope you enjoy it. Reo, welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be fun. It's always good to have like another podcaster on because then, I know that you know what's up. And
And yell at you about your pee-pops there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you know more about podcasting than I probably ever will. So, yeah.
That's not a good thing. I feel like knowing too much about podcasting is a curse.
Well, it's not a good thing for you. It's fine for me.
I guess that's true. You're winning in this equation.
Yes,
that's true.
exactly.
That's true.
But I don't even know how to introduce you to our audience. I mean, you have done so much stuff. I know you best, I think, from your podcast about the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I started working on More Everything Forever and I realized what I was writing a book about, I realized, wait, no, I got to go get lunch with Reo. We got to talk about this. Before we get into it, tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. I'm a journalist. Covered the future in a way, insofar as a journalist can cover the future. Things that have not happened yet is generally not the domain of a journalist. Usually what we do is things that have happened already. And actually, when I first started pitching that show, flash forward around many years ago now, a lot of traditional newsrooms were like, no, it hasn't happened yet. So you can't do journalism on things that haven't happened. And my argument was, in fact, you can in some ways. And so Flash Forward was a show that was on for almost 10 years. And it was about the future. Every episode was kind of a look at a future, possible, very, very much not possible. Like if we dragged a second moon to Earth was one we did early on in the early seasons, but really trying to understand and take kind of these questions to their logical conclusion or extremes, or get at, have we even thought about this idea before? Where does that come from? And so built up this kind of massive episodes about the future, and have a lot of thoughts about how to think about the future now, having thought about it for a long time. The show's over now. It was sort of time to put that show to bed. Now I'm the co-founder of Coyote Media, which is a local worker-owned newsroom in the Bay Area, and I'm working on some other stuff, including a book proposal that is sort of related to probably what we'll talk about here. So you're getting my like truly half-baked thoughts about what this might be about in terms of the future, because I'm sort of trying to think through my next future-related thing.
I think that if this show is about anything, it's about thinking through half-baked ideas about the future.
Excellent. Well, buckle up because I got a lot.
Yeah, that's what we love to do here on Dreaming Against the Machine, a podcast that has been around forever and that I understand really well.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I wanted to talk with you about the sort of power that comes with ideas about what the future holds and the ways that people talk about the power that comes with saying that you know what the future holds. And I know that this is something, when I told you that I wanted to talk with you about this, you got very excited and said that I really needed to get ready to hear a lot about almanacs.
Yeah.
And I want to know what that was about because I don't know anything about almanacs.
the thing that I'm sort of working on right now, and I'm sort of muddling my way through, is this idea about, now when we say a futurist, we're really thinking about a certain kind of person, right? A technologist, somebody who sort of makes these proclamations about what the future will look like, probably from the realm of science and technology, right? Is generally what we think of.
Yep.
And the term futurist is sort of new-ish, depending on how you think about it. It sort of emerges in like the early 1900s for an Italian art movement, which is super interesting. We can talk about if we want to.
Yeah.
But if we expand that out and think about who gets to say what the future is likely to hold, and who occupies that kind of cultural role and why, and how do they use that power, that's sort of what I'm really interested in. And if you look all the way back to the very beginning of humanity, right, we have had people like this forever, right? We've had tribal leaders, we've had religious leaders, we've had astrologers, we've had all different eras, I think, of sort of passing this torch of I am the one who has the kind of special knowledge about the future, and I'm going to tell you what is possible. And in general, throughout history, we see that those people don't use that power for good.
Yeah.
Most of the time. Most of the time, they use that power to enrich themselves. And in fact, largely for regressive means, right? To sort of contain and prevent progress, and prevent people from being liberated or being free or being treated well. And so in the era of almanacs are this really interesting era and this really interesting almost technology for capturing and predicting the future. And they were incredibly powerful, right? They were these incredibly powerful documents. Everyone probably sort of knows, not everyone, many of the listeners of this show probably know that the first real big book printed on the Gutenberg press was the Bible. The first actual thing printed that we know of was an almanac. They are like incredibly potent things. I think at some point, like 1 in 4 people in Britain owned one at any given time. These are incredibly powerful objects. There were these printing press wars fought over who got to be the ones to print the almanac.
Wait, but hold on. I'm going to interrupt you. What do we mean by almanac in this context? I'm wondering if it means the same thing that I'm thinking of.
Well, what are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of like something that's got information about different countries and different cities, and maybe has like the phases of the moon and a calendar and stuff like that.
Phases of the moon and calendar for sure. An almanac traditionally is something that says like, plant your crops on this time. This is what the weather is going to be. This is what the year ahead holds. It sort of shifts into astrological once that becomes popular. But it sort of is a little bit more of kind of what we would sometimes call like a old wives' tales, kind of here's when to plant, here's what to do, here's what's going to happen this year.
Okay.
And in some of these, there were political predictions about what would happen. And in fact, in the 1500s, France wrote a law outlawing making political predictions in almanacs because people would believe them to be true, right? And that's an incredibly powerful thing. And so, right, so we have all these eras of almanac, of future telling, and which things people believed were the people who really knew what was going on. And almanacs are this really interesting, fairly long-lived moment in sort of futurism, right? Where they're the ones that are saying, this is what's going to happen. In the mid-1800s, this really interesting surge of what are called radical almanacs, where you have people who say, okay, there's this really potent thing that everybody has. Can I use that to push a better version of the future through to people? And so you have these almanacs that are, you have the Reformer's Almanac, you have the Untaxed General Almanac, and they are opening with these dedications to the suffering masses. And they are saying, no, actually, this idea that the future is set, the future is written down, that it's in this book that somebody knows is not true. You can do something to change it. And that becomes really dangerous. And so those people printing those radical almanacs become sort of like the targets of government oppression. So it's just a really interesting moment. That's why I was like, I'm ready to talk to you about almanacs, because it's this really interesting moment around this thing that I think today we see is really quaint and kind of silly or just like foolish of like, oh, these people who are just sort of making things up, right? And like putting, I know people have feelings about astrology and like this and that. But they were these really powerful objects, these really powerful forms of technology when we think about who gets to say what the future looks like.
Oh, this is fascinating because you and I, we're roughly the same age. So we remember the world before the web and before the internet exploded, but we've had it around basically our entire adult lives. And this is just another sort of entry for me in the giant category of how did people learn things before the internet? And
Almanacs.
yeah, exactly. Like I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I thought about encyclopedias and stuff like that, but this also is sort of strangely giving me a kind of hope because it's telling me that things like fake news and political conspiracy theories and memes that have no basis in reality are old.
People don't change that much.
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot today about zines, right? And the sort of resurgence of
Yeah.
zine culture right now, which is super exciting to me. And the sort of value in distributing and printing your own kind of way of thinking about the future. And, we're both in Oakland. There's just incredible zine culture here in Oakland. And I have this collection of radical zines now. And when I look at these radical almanacs, it's all I can think about is like people saying, no, 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 there's other ways of thinking about this. There's other things that are possible. And you'd pass them around and you hand them to your friends and you share them, right? And there's this kind of real accessibility to them. Almanacs are really interesting because they're really hard to study because people didn't save them, right? They were sort of they were used by people for kindling. Once the year is over, they're not a functional object anymore.
Right, like a calendar.
Exactly. And so there's this really interesting gap, I think, in a lot of the historical research around this because it's seen as kind of this lowbrow object. It's mostly for people who aren't very educated and they don't get saved. And so there's like not actually that much research on especially these radical almanacs because a lot of them were destroyed. And so I'm super interested in that and the parallels to like zine culture today.
The zine culture thing is very interesting to me because one of the promises of the internet that was around when you and I were kids or like very young adults was this is going to be the great equalizer. This is going to make it possible for anyone to publish a magazine, anyone to get, the word out about anything that they care about, and this will inevitably make the world a better place. On the one hand, we have seen that that is not true in that that's not how the internet works. On the other hand, you could also argue that in some ways the internet never met that early promise in the first place because of the centralization of so many parts of the internet onto giant corporate platforms.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think like anytime you have a giant corporation whose only desire is to make money for shareholders,
Yeah.
it's not about the future. It's not about making a better future. It's about making more money, right, for a certain
Yeah.
small set of people. And so they're incompatible. They're at odds with one another. And when all of the technologies move to those platforms, there's no incentive for them to deliver on that promise. And it's very hard to hold them accountable to do so.
And yet they keep selling that vision of the future, right? They keep saying this is a liberatory technology. I mean, I remember people saying like, oh, social media is clearly going to be a force for social good. Look at the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah.
And it's clearly not what happened, but there is still this notion that I think is very powerful that these, well, two related ideas, I guess, are coming to mind. First, that these things are inherently liberatory in some way when they're not, but also this idea that there's something inevitable about them, that social media has to exist, that these platforms have to exist. Rather than being things that were made by people who made choices about what was going to exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just going back to this sort of bigger question that I'm really interested in, which is how do we decide and give the power of the futurist sort of title to people throughout time? And what you see, and sort of to your earlier point that we actually don't really change, and it's always sort of the same loop over and over again, is that one of the arguments that the people who hold this title make is that their version of the future is inevitable. And you see this all the time. You see this in religious eschatology, right? This end of the world sort of stuff. You see this even in the almanacs, right? It's in the almanac. It's got to be true. You see this in divination techniques. You see this even in early, the birth of economics as a kind of field and domain, right? They're saying, well, it's just math. This is just what will happen because lines go up, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I think there's this really interesting repeated theme of inevitability that allows for the people who hold those positions to lull the masses into accepting their version of the future. And I think that then, of course, at many stages, there are moments where people realize that that's not true, right? And they pull away or they break away. And sometimes that breaking is violent and terrible, and sometimes it's not, right? There's that piece of it. But the inevitability piece is sort of core to the argument. And one of the things I think I'm really interested in is, rather than, as I've traced through this sort of history, rather than simply replacing the last futurist with the next one using that same argument, this person has magical powers about the future. Their version of the future is inevitable. If you follow them, you will make money. If you don't follow them, you'll be punished. Rinse, repeat, right? That we have this kind of cycle. How do we interrupt that logic as opposed to just appoint somebody new into that same loop?
This is not surprising that this is where I'm taking this, but I just keep thinking about the venture capital hype cycle and how it does this, at high speed, right? The blockchain was inevitable. Everything was going to be on the blockchain. It was the future. Don't be left behind. And now it's AI. Everything is going to be AI. It's the future. It's inevitable. It's coming. Don't be left behind. And we don't even bother replacing, the guys, and they are almost all guys, right?
Yeah.
It's the same guys promoting this same stuff, both, within the corporate ecosystem and in the media ecosystem that supports them. So,
I mean, don't you think though do you feel as you look around that there is now more of a resistance to AI and this? It's like being worn away each cycle. It feels. Do you feel that way, or are you seeing that as well?
I feel that way, but I also think that the AI hype has gotten much more traction to begin with than the crypto hype did, for example. Not every hype cycle is going to gain as much share of the public imagination as AI has, right? And I think that there are reasons for that, right? Some of it is certain ideas about the future that it's slotted in well with that were already out there in the world thanks to science fiction. And some of it had to do with particular narratives about the future, like the singularity, that have great currency within
Very
the
real,
tech
definitely going to
ecosystem.
happen.
Oh, yeah. The singularity is nearer or nearer, depending on who
Always.
you ask. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Right around
of
the
course.
corner. Yeah.
Yes, right around the corner. It's coming any day now. I think that you're right. I see a lot of pushback, but I also think that part of the reason that we have that extra pushback is that the AI stuff is louder. And so it's generating more pushback.
Yeah.
And I think that's good, right? I'm glad that that's happening, that we're getting the pushback. But I don't love, I don't, I hate the inevitability stuff around it. People say, well, AI is coming, so we're just going to have to adapt, get on board. It's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, you see this over and over again, right? Like, I mean, the thing I always come back to is sort of religious eschatology, right? This idea that the end of the world is coming at any given time. And this is sort of the singularity piece of it, but sort of this idea that, well, it doesn't really matter what you or I do because there's this sort of greater power of progress, right? Or, whatever God that they are sort of praying to in this moment. Or perhaps they believe themselves to be gods, which I think is often the case, as sort of is, I think, illustrated in your book, your last book.
Yes.
And so, right, like there's this thing of like, how dare you even question? You see the manifesto, right? The techno-futurist manifesto that's put out. That sort of is.
God.
It was one of those moments where I've been working on this book proposal for a while now, on and off. And when Mark Andreessen published this techno manifesto, I literally, that tweet that's like, I've been working on this for years, and he just tweeted it out.
Yes. Yes.
Like,
No,
I
I had the same experience. I was in edits on my book, early edits. I had a bad draft and I was trying to make it a less bad draft. And that, chapter where I talk so much about Andreessen, I had been working on it and I was thinking about, okay, how do I really illustrate what's going on? And like a day or two after I started working on edits on that chapter in particular, this thing drops and I looked at it and I'm like, oh, gross. This is perfect.
Yeah, right.
Exactly,
you're like, well, there you go. He just tweeted it out.
Yeah, he just tweeted it out. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because a couple years ago, I wrote a piece for Wired about the sort of ties between the Italian futurist movement and the modern futurists, right?
Yeah.
And the main tie is fascism, right? That's the main thing. And people were like, oh, you're being so melodramatic, this and that. And then he puts out a manifesto that is very clearly modeled on exactly that, and in fact cites the Italian futurist manifesto. And I was like, the whole time I was right.
So hold on, we got to talk about the Italian Futurist Manifesto.
Yes.
Yes.
The Futurists. Okay. Do you want to set up the Futurists, the Marionetti at all, or how do you? Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you what I know off the top of my head, and then you, I think, probably know more about them. What I know is that Marinetti was this artist
Mhm.
in Italy in the very early 20th century who got very enamored of technology and really liked how fast cars could go. He liked fast cars, but that meant something very different in like 1905 than it does now.
Yeah.
Um, I think he even got into like a car crash or
Yep.
something and thought that this was the most, amazing, dramatic, romantic thing that could happen. And this inspired him to write this futurist manifesto that is all kinds of weird and proto-fascist. And in fact, Marinetti later went on to co-author the Fascist Manifesto about 10, 15 years later. And is also really violent and sexist in surprising ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was a poet.
Yeah.
And I do not read Italian, but I am told that it is best to read in Italian because it is extremely poetic, let's say.
Yeah.
So he was driving in a car. He actually is run off the road by a bicycle. So he's like, "How dare you? The car is this sort of like ultimate machine. You bicyclists are, behind. You're being left behind by this inevitable progress, et cetera, et cetera."
God, so he's the original like minivan mad at bicyclists.
Yeah, or really like a Dodge Charger kind of situation. But
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
this-
yeah.
yes. So yeah, so and
Yes.
he's just this really dramatic. He's a poet. He's very good at getting attention for himself. He's very good at drama and spectacle. And he like unveils he like leaflets cities. He unveils giant banners. Like he just loves a scene. He's very flamboyant, loves a scene. And he is very magnetic. He sort of has this group of people around him that become the futurists, right? The Italian futurists. And it's poets, it's painters, it's chefs. I mean, they love a manifesto. They write a billion manifestos. There's a manifesto about food. There's a manifesto about sex. There's a manifesto about everything. And yes, they are hyper violent, extremely enamored with speed, power, technology. They think weapons are really appealing. I actually had an idea at one point to make a little like web game of like who said it, an Italian futurist or like Elon Musk. And it's like really hard to know. Because they just have this idea like there's beauty in speed, right? They want to glorify war. They think that history is stupid. They think museums are useless.
Yep.
They believe that anybody over 30 was completely pointless. Like once you hit 30, you were over. And so that you should destroy your work because you shouldn't allow it to be in a museum because that's how sort of culture becomes like stayed and all that. And there's this really interesting moment. So 1909-ish is when, I think 1909 is when the manifesto was published. Early 1900s is when he's working. And so World War I breaks out. And a bunch of them are like, great, we love war. And they go off and die in war. And then, or some of them come back and are like, man, war sucks, actually. It turns out war is really bad. And it's really awful to be fighting in a war. World War I, people are dying in war is always brutal, but World War I is that really terrible combination of the weapons have gotten really good and the medical care has not. And so people are dying in just incredibly gruesome, horrible ways. And so there's this really interesting split after that where you have some people who remain dedicated to the cause and then this whole group of artists who become sort of really disillusioned and are like, oh my God, what have we been like? What are we talking about? And there's this really interesting, I think, moment where you see people move away from that. But yes, there's you could just quote from the Italian Futurist manifestos at any time. They're so funny, but also not. They're terrible, right? Because people really believe this. He has a whole vendetta about how like pasta is horrible and like spaghetti is the devil and like there's all it's just like it's incredible stuff. And then World War I happens and they kind of have to face the realities of all of this stuff that is really beautiful and dramatic in their minds and then on the ground is just horrible, right, and awful. And they really were in bed with fascism, at least the sort of core group. Because they believe that, like, by any means necessary, right? They have a line in the Futurist Manifesto that basically says that, rape is fine and that power is all that matters and you should take what you want. And that is the sort of like ultimate way of showing, sort of way of moving forward, right? Is that there's sort of there can be no regret. There can be no sort of like ethics in that way. And so it's a really brutal ideology that was sort of half playtime thing where that sort of classic sort of 4chan-y kind of internet, like they'll just say anything, right? They'll say anything to kind of get a rise out of people. And then when shit hits the fan and reality shows up and World War I happens, a bunch of them are like, oh, no, this sucks, actually. It's terrible, even if it is. Sometimes you read these manifestos and you're like, what in the world? But there is sort of a lot of parallels to the way that people talk today online, the way people sort of really try and hype up speed, right? Move fast, break things. Like there's all of these sort of parallels to today's techno-fascists.
It's striking to me. I mean, I was thinking about this as you were talking. So many of those individual ideas and beats that you were hitting are so deep into the culture of like startup culture, VC culture in the tech industry, contempt for history, contempt for women, which I think is actually a line in the Futurist Manifesto. Is like, we like having contempt for women or something like that. They say something like that. And also, the glorification of youth, speed, power. You can just do things, right? It's and then of course Andreessen did just tweet it out, right? It is, I mean, he paraphrases it, or really he quotes it. It's almost a direct quote from the Futurist Manifesto.
And he includes Marinetti in his list at the end of
Yep.
his sort of icons and icons of the future.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a really interesting historian who studies the women in the futurist movement, right? Of like, how do you participate in a movement like this when there's so much explicit outward contempt for women?
Yeah,
and different
seriously.
people translate that line about contempt for women differently in the manifesto. And that, like, you see this today. And how do women of the far right participate in their own oppression, right? I mean, this is something that we are still engaging with in this question. And the women who've sort of found spaces for themselves, the women who sort of, well, like, oh, it's not me, right? Like I'm on the inside, right? Which is what you see today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that there is this really interesting parallel. And again, like, we see it, we don't change that much, unfortunately or fortunately. I think there are good things too about the ways in which humans can be resilient and sort of repeat if we need to. I can't remember if it was Lewandowski or who said like, "Oh, I don't read books. I think it's a waste of time to read books." Like,
oh yeah, no, that was actually Sam Bankman-Fried.
Okay. I think they both
yeah.
may have said that at some point. But it is a common right. This idea that like, why would I need to learn history?
Yeah,
What
Lewandowski
would that
definitely
do
said
for
the
me?
thing about like, why do I need to read history? That
There
was
we go,
him.
yeah.
That was.
Oh right, Sam
that
Bankman-Fried was
yeah.
like, why would I read a book?
Yes. No, I mean he even said, I think if you wrote a book, you fucked up.
Yeah.
And I saw that and couldn't resist putting it into my book at the beginning of the acknowledgments.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's a good kind of fucking. I think if they think you fucked up, then you're probably doing something right.
Exactly, right? Like if they liked everything that I do, then clearly I went wrong somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus Christ, these people. But yeah, I mean,
fun fact, who hated the Futurists, just as a fun art fact.
Oh yeah,
Picasso. Picasso was like, you guys are fucking idiots. Am I allowed to curse on this show? I realize I did not.
Of course.
Ask.
Oh,
okay,
come on.
okay.
No. Yes. Absolutely. I
always forget to ask beforehand, and then I'm like,
no,
oh God.
it's completely
But yes,
fine.
Picasso was like, you guys are like, this is not it. This is not interesting or whatever. It's a bummer because my sort of toxic trait is that I actually really like the futurist art. Like aesthetically, I enjoy it. I think it is very interesting. The way that they like work with shapes and form and color.
Sure.
And then you have to be like, well, they were also fascists. That's pretty bad. So
I mean, look, we all have problematic faves of some kind or another, right?
Baccioni for me. It's
I like I mean, there's some kinds of like Soviet realism that I think is really like some of the Soviet monuments and memorials are really, amazing. And yet they're also like, and Stalin is amazing and totally not a mass murderer. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, I think we're allowed to find certain things aesthetically pleasing as long as we are also like, okay, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we think that that's good.
Right. And anytime I see an artist today being like, I'm like a modern futurist, and I'm like, maybe don't call yourself that. Like, maybe don't
exactly.
tie yourself to those people.
Well, so that's a question. I mean, how did the term futurist go from meaning this movement to meaning, someone like Alvin Toffler, the guy who wrote Future Shock, and then now, someone like, I don't know, Ray Kurzweil, who the Singularity dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. There's this moment in the 1930s where this idea of being able to predict social trends starts to really bubble up. President Herbert Hoover commissions a report on social trends from these people who kind of are emerging as this field of sort of economists and sort of sociologists and anthropologists who are kind of all interested in, rather than looking back, looking forward, right? And he commissions this giant report. I think it's like 1,500 pages that covers a million things. It's actually fun to kind of poke around in. It's one of those documents where you can just like bop around and see. I mean, it also has a ton of racism in it because it was published in 1933. So there's also that. Yeah. But it sort of starts talking about, okay, actually, trends in women's fashion, right? It used to be that on the sort of high fashion streets in New York, you would see a look and it would be there for the whole season. And now everything's moved. They're sort of already starting to think about like trend forecasting and this is moving around. Devin Powers has a great book called On Trend that is super interesting about all this stuff. And so you have that for a bit. And then in like I think it's late 50s, early 60s, you start to get these consulting institutes, right? The Hudson Institute, you get this idea. And that's where the kind of idea of futurist with a capital F really starts to come into the fore. You have people who are saying, oh, you can hire me and I can help your business kind of understand what's coming, how to think about it. Right. And that kind of starts to move further and further. There's a woman named Faith Popcorn who really kind of solidifies trend forecasting. Wait, that is not her actual name.
Okay. Because
but she goes by Faith Popcorn.
Faith Popcorn.
Faith Popcorn. Okay. She's still alive.
Okay.
She used to be an ad executive and worked on a ton of really iconic ad campaigns in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And then sort of spun off and created her sort of futurist group. But yeah, so you start to have in like the 80s, start to see this idea of futurism with a capital F in the way that we are thinking about it. And it's kind of this blend of marketing, trend forecasting, technology, this idea that you'd be a floater and a consultant, right? The consultant class kind of emerges in this, like sort of around the 50s. And that all kind of comes together into this sort of weird moment where we get futurists that we think of today as these kind of like sci-fi technology, stuff. And then of course today there's sort of an interesting, I think there's a lot to be said about today's futurists and sort of the ways in which some of them are just business consultants. Some of them are science fiction writers. Some of them are doing some weird third thing that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and sort of like how that industry operates. You can now get a degree, right, in foresight. That is a thing you can get a master's degree in. And some of those people do good work and are genuinely interested in how do we read signals? What does that mean? How do we analyze a lot of data? How do we bring it in? What does that mean? And some of them are just trying to subsidize their science fiction writing careers by taking money from giant corporations, which is also totally fair,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. In the future, we'd like to move beyond capitalism, but unfortunately for now, we live in it, and that means we have to run ads, but they're for good stuff. So here's a message from the show's sponsors. There's a question that I have never gotten a good answer to, and I'm not expecting.
I don't know that I'm going to have one.
Yeah, I don't know that you will, but we're going to talk about it.
Okay.
I'm noticing that like the rise of the sort of professional futurist, it coincides with the creation of this idea about the future in the golden age of science fiction in the US that has been incredibly durable culturally, right? This idea that the future has to be in space, that it's going to involve rocket ships and robots, that there's going to be space colonization, and it's going to, that is the future, that there's flying cars and jetpacks, and that this is the future we were quote unquote promised, right? That Peter Thiel line, we were promised flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. And I think that Peter Thiel is a monster, but I understand what he's pointing at when he says that. And I think it's striking that, 75-ish years on, we still have this idea of what the future is that's sort of in the cultural psyche, at least in this country, that would have been very comfortable on the front page of like Astounding Magazine in 1955.
And your question is why?
Yeah.
I think that it's a couple of things. I think that vision of the future rises because it is inherently linked to changes in the way that and the types of goods that are manufactured, right? You have
Mm.
glass being cheap and affordable and like everything made of glass, right? You have World's Fair saying we have these, homes of the future that's full of glass and plastic, right? Those are the two materials that are really important. How do we
Yeah.
use those materials, right? And so I think you're seeing this sort of interplay between consumerism and this idea of progress as being something that should be attainable to a person and material related, right? Glass, plastic, moldable objects, things you can mass produce, right? You have Henry Ford, you have the Chicago World's Fair where you have the kitchen of the future, right? You have Design for Dreaming, which is it's a musical about cars and the future of cars. And so I think there's this, idea that I think that futurisms in that moment are so tied to what we are suddenly learning how to make and manufacture in the United States. And I think this is a very US centric form of the future, right? That is very
Yeah.
bounded to the United States. When you look at other cultures, their forms of futurism are very different and don't
Yeah.
involve a lot of that same stuff. But in the US, you have that sort of link between manufacturing, consumerism, and science fiction, even as science fiction authors are trying to sort of pretend like they are separate from
Yeah.
those things. And I think that part of the reason why we still see that preserving is because science fiction hasn't given us something more compelling. And I love science fiction. I think science fiction's great. I read a lot of it.
Yeah. Same.
The reason that I think we haven't seen a replacement is because to the folks who control manufacturing in the United States, there isn't a more compelling sci-fi future, right?
Got
The
it.
people who are making rockets, the people who are making the stuff that controls the platforms, that controls all of the manufacturing, that controls politics, right, in the US, like we've talked about, the reason why the internet kind of sucks, right? The sort of consolidation to these companies, they need consumers to buy certain kinds of things and to think certain kinds of things. And the kind of futures that help support that are the ones that are all about going to space and all about these sort of material things that they manufacture. Surprise. Now, of course, they're not delivering on that, right? They're not delivering on flying cars. They're not delivering
Of
on
course.
some of this other stuff. But there's enough of a link, I think, between those two things that you see it just entrenched in the sort of hyper-capitalist mega corporation people. And that's the stuff they're most interested in. I mean, when you hear these guys talk about what their favorite sci-fi is, it's all those kinds of things because that's
Yep.
the work that they can imagine themselves doing and the material they know how to work with.
This is a fascinating answer. I love this because it's also such a good way of thinking about their misreading of that science fiction and the few elements of more recent science fiction that they're willing to pull in, right? There's this recording of Peter Thiel from about 15 years ago where he says that you should use mid 20th century science fiction as a blueprint for what you want to do in the future. And then he says that blueprint is develop the oceans, develop the deserts, develop space. And like develop here is clearly a euphemism for exploit. But also in that context, develop the deserts, that sounds like he's just completely misunderstanding what Dune is about. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't go great, let's say.
no, no, it doesn't. Like, and
maybe he's there for the incest. Who knows? There's a lot of that in Dune. I don't know, man. I don't know what he's into.
I mean, honestly, there's a lot of that in mid 20th century science fiction, full
That's
stop, right?
very true.
Heinlein's also into that.
Yeah.
And like, and it's the further right stuff has more of it. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah,
I mean,
magical
yeah.
sex witches and incest is like a lot of
Yeah.
Dune. So
No,
anyway.
it's absolutely true. Yes. And
well, didn't
clearly what
Elon
we're going to
Musk
be
say that
discussing
his
about.
favorite book was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at some point?
Yeah. Musk said that, and he said that it was a book that was about, figuring out the meaning of the universe, which is the question, or something like that. Basically, taking this giant joke from the book and thinking that it's a real profound philosophical insight that he alone understands. Like, I there's a wonderful review of Isaacson's Musk biography that Jill Lepore wrote in the New Yorker that is just a lovely takedown of Musk's ideas about science fiction. And she points out that Douglas Adams, like in the 70s and 80s, was famously writing on a typewriter with a bumper sticker on the side that said "End Apartheid."
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, giant tech billionaires like Musk are some of the main targets of the satire that Adams is,
I was gonna
writing
like.
there.
I mean,
Yeah.
like Zaphod is so close. Like, it's not even like, it's truly, it's tough. As soon as I heard that, I was like, you know that you are in this book, but not in a good way.
Yeah. Oh, come on. But Zaphod's just this guy, you know?
He's just a guy, man.
Yeah.
I don't know. It is wild to me that they're like, I don't like books. I don't think anyone should read books, but I'm going to sort of selectively read books and take the wrong. I mean, there's like, this is the like classic tweet for a reason, right? Where it's like, I have finally created the Torment Nexus.
Exactly.
The sci-fi book, please don't create the Torment Nexus. Like,
right. No, that's exactly it. I mean, like, and so what do they take from the more recent science fiction? They take the metaverse, which nobody wants. They take the idea of the singularity, which, was around in earlier science fiction, but, came to full flower in later science fiction, but is fully compatible with these hyper-capitalist dreams that the tech oligarchs and, business magnates have.
Or they see something, and I think I'm really interested in the sort of Rick and Morty effect. I don't know if you've watched that at all.
I have watched some, yes.
Which I actually really like Rick and Morty, which is unfortunate because all of its fans are like people I do not want to be around.
Yeah,
but
talk about a toxic trait.
Yeah, it's very clear to me, at least, in the show that Rick is a villain. Like, he sucks. And like, that's very clear. Yes. And the problem is that all these fans are like, Rick's my guy. And I'm like, what are we doing here?
You don't want to be Rick. You don't want to be Rick.
That's a bad man. He's bad.
Yeah.
He's abusive and terrible. It's bad.
And even Rick doesn't want to be Rick. Rick talks constantly about how he doesn't want to be who he is.
Right. And so there's this thing of people sort of, and I don't know whether it's media literacy or whether it's like stan culture where you're either a fan or a hater and there's no sort of in between and sort of inability to kind of, I don't know. I had to like close my computer the other day because someone on Tumblr was really mad that Brokeback Mountain didn't have a happy ending because like queer people deserve a happy ending. And I was like,
what?
I have to walk away I have to go to the grass. I can't handle this right now. But there's just this feeling of like, I do think that there is a real lack of ability to critically think about some of the media that people are consuming, which is, I don't think that is the reason that these terrible men are doing. I think they have other problems that they, personality traits and issues. But it is something I'm really interested in when I think about dystopian fiction or fiction around getting at some of these hard questions and warnings and trying to talk about, okay, what would it be like if we did this, if we really went down this road? And if people kind of can't grapple with a complicated message where no one's a hero, maybe, or it is more complicated, I think that's tough, right? It's like makes it hard to really talk about the future and really talk about what do you do with these complex people who are making decisions in the moment that might not be the right ones, and how do we come back from that, right? Like, what does repair look like? How do we handle that? I mean, Octavia Butler is so good at addressing those questions, but all of her characters are super complicated, right? There is a lot of nuance there. And I don't know, it's hard for me sometimes to imagine, I mean, setting aside, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel at all, like, there's no amount of science fiction that will fix them. But when we think about like regular people who are sort of making choices in the world about how to engage and how to respond to the things that those men are doing and saying, I am really interested in how do we teach people to be better and more thoughtful consumers of some of these stories?
Well, so this brings me back to something that you were talking about earlier, and maybe this is a good place to sort of close things out. You were saying that you're interested in the people who call themselves futurists, but also how do we break out of the cycle of, just anointing someone else as a futurist and instead finding a better way forward to think about what the future is. How do we do that? How do we solve all the world's problems?
I know, that's $1 million question. I mean, I think this is the tough thing, right? Because this requires breaking millennia of human behavior, right? And I don't think that we're doing that. I'm not, but I do think that this is going to sound really cheesy, but I actually genuinely believe that the first part of doing this is even recognizing that it's happening, right?
Yep.
Naming the system, naming the thing and saying, hey, we keep falling into this cycle. Are we doing that right now? What does that look like? I think this is why I'm really hesitant to just sort of reappoint, like, oh, put all women in charge, or oh, like we'll just like do X, and it's like, well, women can do crimes too, actually.
Yeah.
And so,
feminism.
Exactly. Yeah, girl boss gatekeep, lean in.
Yes, exactly.
And so, yeah, so I just think that like being able to think about where is this coming from? What do I actually want? I think that there are a lot of really beautiful models for collective decision making, collective memory that exist all over the world. Often in indigenous cultures, right? Around how do we share decision making? How do we share memory? How do we think about what expertise looks like that isn't just a PhD or isn't just having a shitload of money? And, I don't want to suggest that some people don't have expertise, right? There's a certain version of this that if you go too far down this road, you end up in like Maha land of like, I can decide if I should get vaccines or whatever, right?
Yes, we all
expertise
do our own
is real,
research.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yes.
But like, how do we share decision making? How do we share collective knowledge? How do we think about structuring our communities and our decisions around care and other sort of incentives that aren't just sort of concentrating power and money and attention and, influence all to the top, right? Or to the side or to a person, whether that's an influencer on YouTube or, the president or whatever else, or your weird neighbor. Like, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that this can happen. And I think that recognizing those patterns is the first part of it. And then from there, we get to make a choice. And I think that that's really interesting. And someone I know just said something recently to me, so I'm going to say it because it's been on my mind a lot, which is that we use the phrase make a choice. A choice is not something you find. It's not something you like discover on the street. You make, it's a creative act. Like we get to make this choice. We get to make the future. And I think acknowledging that, obviously there are limitations. You and I can't stop nuclear war from happening, probably, unfortunately. I don't want to be like, you can do it, right? I think there is a certain amount of naivete around some of the messaging around that. But it's also not completely nihilistic, right? Like we have opportunities in getting involved in your community, getting involved in people figuring out where you can make a better future in a small way that then does actually have an influence in a big way. There's been, I think, this unfortunate overextension of the very real fact that personal responsibility can't fix every single problem in the world. And so people will be like, recycling doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter what you do because the corporations, and yes, corporations have an outsized responsibility to fix things, but also it does matter what you do. In fact, there's research that shows that it does matter what you do and that if you recycle, then your neighbors will probably recycle and there will be impact down the stream. So I think that's probably my very cheesy answer, which is just see it, recognize it, and then make a different choice.
So I make the joke a lot on here that, this is what Dreaming Against the Machine is about, where this is, any number of things. But I really mean it when I say that being unironic and cheesy in this way really is a lot of what I want this podcast to be about. And so I love that you were willing to do that. And I agree with you that that's cheesy. And I also think that it's correct.
Great.
So, yeah. And I think that I can't think of a better place to close it. So thank you, Reo, for coming on here.
Cheesy and correct. I'm going to put that in my bio.
Yes, absolutely. Cheesy and correct. Adam
Cheesy
Becker, this guy. Yeah.
Put it on the front. I'm blurbing the book already.
Yes, exactly. Oh my God. Amazing. Well, I'm really excited to see what happens with your book proposal and your book.
Thank you.
And I am sure we're going to have you on again because we're not done talking about this.
Yeah. I mean, the future is always happening at any given moment. So there's always something to talk about.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you again to this week's guest, Reo Eveleth. Coming up next week, our guest will be Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, and we'll be talking about, among other things, Star Trek. To submit questions for future guests and to suggest other guests, and to see more pictures of Babka, join the conversation on Patreon. You can also find us on YouTube, on Instagram at DATMPod, on the web and on Blue Sky at dreamingagainstthemachine.com, or just find us wherever you get your podcasts. Dreaming Against the Machine is a proud member of Multitude Productions. Our executive producer is Nick Carissimi. Our associate producer is Rosie Thomas. Our theme music is by Jared Emerson Johnson. Our show logo is by Nick James. And our fearless leader is Babka, the greatest cat in the observable universe. I'm Adam Becker, and I'll see you next week.